Okay, thanks everybody for joining us for today's Cyberpion Attack Surface Protection Series webinar, the State of Fortune 500 Attack Surface Threats. I'm joined today by Michael Groskop, who's the Chief Product Officer at Cyberpion, and he will be giving today's presentation. Before we get started, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items as normal on a webinar. First of all, the webinar is being recorded today, so we will be sending a link to the recording of the webinar to all who attended afterwards in the next day or so. Second of all, we look to have this presentation be about 30 to 40 minutes, and we'll have plenty of time for question and answers at the end. So all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. If you have any questions at any time, however, feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom webinar console, and you can enter your questions at any time, and then we'll answer them all at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Michael Groskop. He's the Chief Product Officer at Cyberpion, and in that role, he's in charge of leading the product strategy for Cyberpion's attack surface management platform. Prior to joining Cyberpion, Michael was VP of Product Management Portfolio at Radware, and he's held a variety of other senior software management roles at companies like Protegrity and Cavato. So I'd like to introduce Michael Groskop. Take it away, Michael.
Hello, thank you. Welcome, everyone. I would like to walk you through that discussion, this webinar. We will be talking about the Fortune 500 as a reference for our analysis and our discussion here. And basically talk about the attack surface context here. So eventually, the agenda that I would like to cover today is the attack surface, how it's growing fast and all the implications of it, the indicators of exposure, which are eventually reflecting the risk of the attack surface, and how vulnerability management are challenging in some parts. And I will refer to some external thoughts on attack surface context as well. Second, we'll be talking about Cyberpion Labs research and findings. We'll be talking about Fortune 500 attack surface discovery, the assets they have, and then the risk against these environments. We'll then have an analysis of the Cyberpion Labs research, and we'll finish with key takeaways that we can take from this discussion. Let me start with the attack surface. And part of it is aligned or strongly aligned with what Gartner Emerging Tech Impact Radar report that was published just 3 weeks ago. Is also making that statement, but we strongly believe that it is how we see and how we experience that context. And the play is eventually around the attack surface and how it's growing and growing fast. The play of organizations are becoming more digital. They're moving to the public cloud. They're generating more applications. And eventually, the assets they have are part of that context and that environment of the organization becoming digital. The IT environment is becoming more complex. When we're talking about more assets, we're talking about new technologies. We're talking about new environments. We're talking about on-premises applications. We're talking about public cloud environments. We're talking about multiple public cloud environments. And this play of hybrid environments is definitely part of the challenge. But the play of old and new technologies is even more challenging because we're talking about environments which not always easy to manage, control. It's not always environments where it's easy to upgrade and install patches to these environments. And in new cases where we're talking about more modern type of applications, sometimes the pace of new vulnerabilities in these environments are becoming more challenging. And this mixture and hybrid environment is part of the challenge and part of the reason why it's complex. Eventually, the perimeter of the environment is extending and becoming even vague and not clear how to manage and how to define what perimeter is. When we're talking about merger and acquisitions and organizations, especially in the context of Fortune 500, we'll be referring to introduction of new mergers into the context of the environment of the organization is definitely changing the scope of what a perimeter is. When you have subsidiaries, the definition of how you kind of define that is not always obvious. But the more challenging aspects are SaaS applications. Imagine like different services that you might be using, software as a service environment, where your data is there. Is it part of your perimeter? Is it not? What happens when you have reliance on vendors? What happens when you have third parties and dependencies on third parties in part of your discussions? We'll cover it and I'll refer to that context. But these are the different dimensions would make the perimeter more extending, more vague, and more challenging to control. And eventually, this is where we kind of hit the bottom line of the context, which is that the growing attack surface is increasingly difficult to manage. And the kind of highlights of that context is the fact that eventually organizations don't know all their assets. They're aware of some of it, most of it, but not all of them. Some of their assets, both those that they know about and the unknown, might be uncontrolled. There might be under the vendor scenarios and the dependencies and the third-party context. And this context also defines the risk involved with the unknown and uncontrolled assets. And this is the important kind of aspects of it. And around this, we would like to discuss and review the research that we conducted. So let's better understand first what attack surface is. Attack surface is eventually based on three major concepts. One, we're talking about the risk exposed to an attacker, all the risks. And when we're talking about risks are eventually across all different vectors or attack vectors. And those attack vectors are relevant across all organizational assets, known and unknown. And this play of having full visibility into the assets of the organization, taking into account multiple attack vectors, and we're talking about tons of different categories, spaces, environments of attack vectors. And we're taking into account all the different risks that we expose to the attacker. This kind of triplet of three different angles are defining what an organizational attack surface is. If we take the third point, which are the organizational assets, we can talk about multiple categories. These are just references and examples of organizational asset types. We can be talking about FQDNs, fully qualified domain names. These are domains or subdomains. Some of it might be related to direct organizational assets, where others might be related to third parties or external assets that might be relevant to your environment. And this is just the DNS or the context of domains in this environment. The IP addresses and IP blocks, which are part of what we define as the organization. We can be talking about certificates, SSL or TLS certificates, which are also defining kind of part of the context of our assets. We can be talking about protocols, HTTP, HTTPS, SSL, SSH, Telnet, FTP, and many others. We're talking about technologies. How are applications being delivered? On top of which technologies, which frameworks we're talking about? PHP, Apache, Java. Can be talking about services. We're talking about web application services, email, databases, storage, and many, many other types of services. And naturally take into account that we're talking also about public cloud and private clouds, naturally on-premises environment. And we can have all the different variety of these environments. It's essential to have full visibility into the organizational assets to really get a clear understanding of the attack surface. But if we take the second dimension of the different attack vectors across all the different exposure of these, we're going back to the kind of second level of the attack surface risk exposure, which refers eventually to indicators of exposure. We want to understand eventually how we expose on top of these assets and make them accessible to an attacker. It can be anywhere from published CVEs on software that we have in our environment on top of our assets. Can be other types of vulnerabilities that either were not published and not referred, zero-day attacks or others. Can be misconfigurations, which, by the way, sometimes also referred as vulnerabilities, but let's refer to it more concretely as misconfigurations of our environment. Misconfigurations can be anywhere from public cloud settings, can be around misconfigurations of our security solutions, our network firewalls, our WAFs, or many other misconfigurations of our environment, user access and so forth. And then we have dependencies of third parties and compromised external assets that might be relevant to this environment, and naturally kind of referring to the risky connection, which we will cover in our discussion. So this is kind of setting the stage of our environment in terms of the implications of better understanding the highlights of what attack surface is. Going back to the first step or first item or second item that I referred on the previous risk context, CVEs. This is an information published by NIST referring to the past 8 years of the vulnerabilities that were published. If we refer back to 2022, we're talking about more than 22 new CVs that were published this year, and this year haven't ended yet. When we're trying to analyze the growth in the number of vulnerabilities over these 8 years, we're talking about 22% annual growth in number of CVs, number of vulnerabilities published in these environments. And this huge growth is naturally part of the problem. And the enormous numbers of 22,000 new CVEs is naturally a major challenge. But even within that environment, and these are the red kind of part of the bars, are the critical vulnerabilities, more than 3,861 vulnerabilities this year. Saying more because probably since we picked that information and that data, it was already probably updated. 3,861 vulnerabilities, critical vulnerabilities with CVSS 9 and above scored this year only. So this is kind of part of the challenge of how the attack surface is growing, how more assets we have, how different technologies we have in our environment, and actually all the CVEs and vulnerabilities in our environment, misconfigurations that set kind of the challenge. Cyberpion Labs conducted a research on the Fortune 500, and this is eventually kind of a reference analysis in our environment. And the reason we picked up Fortune 500 organizations because it's an interesting reference. They have multiple different industries, so we're not picking up like only a certain kind of category, but rather all the different 21 industries that we're referring to, commonly used. There are big companies with subsidiaries, with merger and acquisitions, with new technologies, new assets, and new risks in their environments. And it provides kind of a broader context to that play. We're not kind of referring to smaller because then it might also be relevant, but the Fortune 500 are a strong and powerful reference category. We conducted the research on 471 Fortune 500 organizations. The research was conducted during 2022. It took several months to conduct that environment. And bear in mind that we define assets because it's very important in our discussions in the following slides as FQDNs. While I was talking about multiple assets like TLS certificates, IP addresses, and IP blocks, and so forth, those are not referred in our analysis, in our research as assets, only FQDNs, fully qualified domain names. So with that, let's get kind of a look into part of the discussion and part of the value that we introduce here. So the first step was to understand how many organizational assets the different Fortune 500 organizations have. And the average is 10,000 active assets, the organizational assets. As you can see, naturally, telecommunication, media, technology are the more kind of active players in that environment with more than 87,000 assets that telecommunication industry players are relevant with. And we see eventually the activities or for other industries, the number of assets is declining, but 10,000 is the average. But the interesting part about those organizational assets is the risk assessment. On top of these assets, we're talking about critical vulnerabilities with CVSS 9 and above across all the different organizations that we analyze with more than 170,000 critical vulnerabilities across these environments. 98% of Fortune 500 analyzed organizations had critical vulnerabilities on their organizational assets. And when we're talking about the average, we're talking about 361 critical vulnerabilities per organization in average. But the interesting parts are not just the critical vulnerabilities, because even obvious, basic, fundamental steps are relevant across the board and with many, many players there. We took like a simple example of expired certificates, which are relevant to 95% of the organizations. Login pages, which are accessible over HTTP across 85% of the organizations. So it's not just the sophisticated, fast-growing assets with multiple new CVEs that were published that are not always kept up with, but even basic kind of fundamental steps that are not addressed there. The next step that I would like to refer to are external assets. There is a whole concept that I'll cover in the following slides in terms of how internal or domain or organization assets are relevant against external assets, but think of it as a connection. I'll cover it on the following slides. But if you look at the right-hand side pie chart, you can see that internal connections are representing eventually 28% of these connections, while 72% are connected to external environments. And when we're trying to understand what is the number of external assets that our assets are connected to, eventually, we see that we're talking about more than 3,000 in an average, with some industries such as telecommunication, where we're talking about almost 12,000 external assets relevant to the environment. But if we talk about external assets with critical vulnerabilities, again, CVSS 9 and above, we're talking about 100% of the organizations that we conducted the analysis, the research on, had a connection with at least one external asset with critical vulnerability in these environments. And the situation where so many different dependencies, both our internal organizational assets and external that we're dependent on, representing that high or that broad range of critical vulnerabilities in these environments. But now let's spend a couple of minutes to better understand the context of external assets and the connections and the play around this. So what a connection to an external asset is. First, let's understand what a type of a connection. We're talking about multiple levels and categories, but let's start with web connections. They're basic kind of simplistic type of connections like hyperlinks or redirects from our web page, 302 and so forth. But we can also have more advanced or intensive kind of connections like script inclusion, for example. DNS connection like authoritative name servers, mail connections to mail servers, and many others. But these are the interesting and relevant kind of dimensions of what a type of connection is. The external assets themselves to whom we may be connected over the different connection types that are referred to are the following categories: safe, non-vulnerable assets, those that are vulnerable, and I referred to it on the previous slide; exploitable vulnerable assets, those that both have vulnerability and have an exploit available or accessible published against those vulnerabilities. And then the next level of concept and concern is the potential compromised assets, and the worst case is the compromised asset. And the interesting dimension here is that when we take strong connections, like the three top categories, web connections like script inclusion, DNS connections, and mail servers, and at the same time, we consider these types of connections to be connected to assets at critical risk, like exploitable vulnerabilities, potential compromised or compromised assets. This is where we end up with a critical risky connection. Taking strong connections from our organizational assets, connecting to external assets that are at risk, this is how we end up with critical risky connection. Now let's see the reflection of critical risky connections in Fortune 500. We see that eventually total critical risky connections found across the organizations that we analyzed, there were 3,752. 62% of the organizations had a critical risky connection, with an average number of 8 critical risky connections per organization in the environment, where some activities such as the food and drug stores had much more than 8. So we're talking here about strong connection to risky environment, risky asset, bringing the critical risky connection in that context. Now let's take a simple example of what a critical risky connection is. In this environment, we have a browser, which is connecting to an application, sending a GET request to that page, getting back an HTML. Within that HTML, we can have, for example, script inclusion, And that script inclusion will send a GET request to a third party. And that third party will return back code that will be processed in our environment. And as a result, we'll be pushing some findings and some information that we'll send back to that third party, like analytics data in this example. And this is a legit scenario, completely legit. But let's take a more challenging scenario. Let's assume that a third party is a compromised asset. In that scenario, when we're sending a GET request to our application server and getting back the HTML, we already have that connection, but this time to a compromised asset. In this case, we send a request to that third party, and as a result, we're getting manipulated code. And this part is the concern, because this manipulated code can do whatever it may. For example, in this scenario, it can extract data from our browser in our environment, like taking credentials, profiles, information, and so forth. And this is an example of MageCart type of an attack that can be conducted using or leveraging these types of scenarios. So we've discussed Fortune 500 analysis. We talked about the organizational assets. We talked about vulnerabilities on the organizational assets. We talked about external assets. We talked about vulnerabilities on top of the external assets. And then we talked about critical risky connections to these environments and the possible implications of it, like the MageCart in the example I referred to. But now let's take kind of an analysis of what we learned from that environment, from that research. We see that Fortune 500 industry with highest risk are eventually these two industries. Telecommunication has the largest number of external assets with critical vulnerabilities, with 710 critical external assets with critical vulnerabilities. Food and drug stores have the largest number of critical risky connections, 29, way more than the average of 8, followed by healthcare with 25 critical risky connections. We also understand, and we referred to it already, but this is important to understand, that fundamental attack surface exposure issues still trouble Fortune 500. Experience certificates, HTTP-based login pages, protocols that are exposed like remote desktop connection, SSH, Telnet, FTPs, and so forth. But the next two are even more challenging. Because when we're trying to understand what we've learned from that research is that Fortune 500 organization perimeter is extending and becoming more challenging. 100% of these organizations have connections to external assets with at least one with critical vulnerability. 62% of these organizations have critical risky connections to these assets, strong connections to risky assets. And these two kind of numbers are already much of a concern, and I reflected some of the kind of implications of this type of context. But the other interesting aspect that are the vulnerability management challenges that don't work or don't work well, even on Fortune 500 organizations. When we're talking about 10,000 assets in average, we're talking about 22,000 new CVs that were published in 2022. We're talking about 22% growth rate per year. According to the NIST, we're talking a real challenge here. And the average number of critical vulnerabilities, CVSS 9 and above, are 476. These are major concerns that we need to learn, eventually analyze based or extract that based on the research that we've conducted at Cyberpion. So now let's go back to the context of what we can learn. What are the takeaways that we can take from this analysis, the information from the research that we conducted, and what we learned from this, and how we suggest moving forward with this. But first step, I would like to refer to a third different kind of research, which is putting some context to how we need to think of kind of priorities. Oxford University Press published in September 2020 a report about how improving vulnerability remediation through better exploit prediction. And they're talking about two very interesting dimensions that I would like to refer to. When we're talking about all CVs that they have analyzed, they have referred, among the 76,000 CVEs, they referred to the 9.7 thousand published exploits that were out there. But the interesting part here, that the exploited vulnerabilities out there eventually were at least half of them, 2.1 thousand vulnerabilities were part of the published exploits. And the other part was part of the other CVEs. The point here is that these 2.1 CVEs that were exploited are part of the published exploits. Published exploits are major concern, very high risk. But the other dimension, which is extremely relevant, is how the CVSS score impacts the exploitability of a CVE. What we can easily see here is that CVSS 9 and 10, the critical risky critical vulnerabilities that I was referring to in my presentations, are the top CVEs that were exploited. When we take these two dimensions, consider the exploitable or published exploit type of vulnerabilities and the high CVSS, this is where you end up with the primary context of your environment. And with these two kind of contexts, eventually we need to go back to our kind of key takeaways. And the point here is that we need to manage the attack surface. The first step is to discover what you have. Know the known and the unknown, both the organizational assets and the external assets. Identify and know your external dependencies and connections to your assets. And by this, know your exposure to the environment. If you don't know your assets, you don't know your dependencies on third parties, you will not be able to expose your risk and we will not have clear attack surface understanding. The next step is to assess indicators of exposure. Extract all the relevant information, anywhere from vulnerabilities, connections to external vulnerabilities assets, and analyze against it the risk of your environment. But beyond the know, the next step is the act. And the act, the first, would be focused on urgent and important. And the do first kind of context of our discussion here. The attacker context is the exploit. Take it into account. Second context is critical risky connections and critical vulnerabilities. This is next step. And then take into account also the organizational context. How can I secure the assets which are important to me? I want naturally to secure against all exploits. I naturally want to secure against critical connections and critical vulnerabilities. But first, take into account how important the asset is and make sure that you address it as well. And then the next step would be to reduce the organizational risk even beyond that level. We need to take into account other vulnerabilities and we need to keep attack surface as small as needed. Part of the challenge is that the attack surface is growing because we have more assets, more services. At the same time, we have a lot of these assets and a lot of these services that we already have in place, which are not necessarily required. And they are at the same time exposing our attack surface. Take it into account and consider reducing it as possible. If we're talking about exploitability, CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, is publishing this information. Start with this. Start with exploitable. Going back to the previous discussion that I was discussing in the research that was published and I referred to. Focus on the exploited information. We're talking about 50, 60. This is where you start with. Next step, going back to the vulnerabilities, focus on the critical vulnerabilities, the red section. Focus on those. And the next step would be to address the other vulnerabilities that you may have in your environment and be in control of it. Now, I would like to summarize with how reducing attack surface and reducing the risk exposure is naturally the right path to go. And part of the solution that we deliver eventually is reflected with this mature organization process that have implemented our solution to get all that context. All the vulnerabilities that were identified over time, it took some time. And as you can see, kind of the days to close were significantly reducing. The number of assets with open vulnerabilities was reducing. And eventually they started with the risky, critical context and reduced it over time. And as you can see, we're in a very pleasant position where the risk is dramatically reduced compared to where it was just a couple of years back. This is a great reference of how we should operate, how we can assist the customer progressing there and making that progress and moving forward with this environment. That would be it on my end. Thank you for the participation and joining. I would be open now for questions.
Thanks, Michael. So as I mentioned earlier, if you have any questions for Michael about the presentation or about attack surface management in general, please use the Q&A box at the bottom or at the top of your Zoom webinar console. Michael, we have a couple of questions that came in via private message here. The first one is, what is the percentage of assets that are typically unknown to an organization?
Interesting question. Based on the information that we find from POVs that we conduct with different prospects and customers, naturally, we end up with the interesting range of anywhere between 10 and 20%. This is the average. It's not always the case. You might see kind of different environments. It's not always obvious because some organizations will share that information and we may get kind of a context of maybe this is not mine, maybe this is not an asset of my organization. And we still eventually go through that process and expose and share all the context of why we believe this is part of their environment and this is where they better understand. 10 to 20%.
Okay, great. Another question that's come in. How does your solution address the small and mid-sized enterprise market, the SME market?
Okay, so let me put it that way. While definitely a significant portion of organizations are targeting eventually larger organizations, enterprises, global enterprises, we definitely have customers who are smaller organizations with smaller numbers. They're not not having 10,000 assets, but also in the range of 1,000 and even sometimes even less than 1,000 assets. Naturally, if we're talking about like just dozens of assets, and that would be the entire kind of set, it's kind of might be also relevant, but these are not common use cases where we operate. It's extremely important because even for small, medium type of environments, eventually these types of solutions might be relevant and interesting, especially for small organizations where they don't have full security solutions implemented, proper security policy set, misconfigurations in their environment. This may definitely be relevant and interesting.
Great. And Michael, another question that's come in. I've heard that false positives are a big problem. Can you address that issue?
Completely. So let's put kind of a context to this. False positives can fall under two categories that I refer to. The first level is how we identify the assets of the organization. And on the one hand, don't have false positives and don't have false negatives, meaning we expose all the assets that our organization has, but don't add like additional assets which are not the organizational assets, but others. The space is challenging, and part of the way we implement this is anywhere from implementing machine learning capabilities into these environments, defining a full mechanism of rules to improve the quality of discovery, and we end up with very, very small number of false positives at that category. Well, at the same time, we end up always POVs with a clear understanding that our quality of discovery, meaning false negatives, is probably the best in this space. Going back to the assessment categories and addressing false positives in this environment, part of what we do is naturally analyzing your technologies. We're analyzing your environments. We're analyzing protocols. We're conducting multiple tests in your environment to provide as accurate answer as possible. With some assessments, some categories, and bear in mind that we conduct like 12 assessment categories. With some of them, there are 0 false positives. When I, for example, conducting like a connect over a certain protocol to a certain port, and I can connect to it, there is no false positives. It's completely clear. With other environments where we're talking about like vulnerabilities of software, vulnerabilities of infrastructure, we may end up with a bit more false positives, but the numbers are not high. Numbers are completely in control and low in terms of implications.
Okay, great. Another question that's come in from the audience here. Today, there are over 100 attack surface management solutions. How is Cyberpion different from the herd?
Okay, yeah, 100 is an impressive number. I definitely agree. There are many players in that space, but let me kind of focus on what we do and how we operate in that context and what we bring different to the environment. First of all, the quality of the asset discovery is definitely a major differentiation we have. We conduct a lot of these POVs where always we get a very clear answer from customers that pick up, and even those that will not eventually select our solution, that we have the best discovery in their context. It's extremely important because unknown assets awareness is the first step to make sure that you address this environment. The second step is the assessment, and there are multiple players, and different players have different assessment, different analysis, different vulnerability play. But the interesting part is the third level. And the third level is eventually, how do you act? And I referred to it in my presentation. The way we act is how we provide you the important aspects, the critical capabilities. This is part of how we operate the service. I talked about critical risky connections. I talked about the digital supply chain. I talked about external assets. These aspects are the unique play that we introduce. I gave you just simple example of critical connections. We both discover these external assets, we discover your connections to these, and we can assess and analyze the critical risky connections to these environments. And this is something that only we do. And then the last point, which is extremely relevant, in many cases, we can also automatically resolve, address, or prevent the risk in your environment through the nature of our solutions in that context. We are not only dependent on opening action items to their customer to address, resolve, patch it, or upgrade a software, or take a certain kind of, for example, network firewall configuration settings. Sometimes for certain and critical concerns that we have and we can identify, we can automatically prevent that concern or avoid it or take an action automatically to make sure that we address this kind of level of challenge.
Okay, and there's kind of a follow-up question to that one, which is what category of attack surface management do you identify with?
So we start with web application assessments where we can conduct multiple types of analysis through the environment and identify multiple different vulnerabilities and concerns in that environment. We cover DNS in these environments where we make sure that we can identify misconfigurations and all the different concerns of settings. Some of it is also kind of related to what I discussed today as well. There are PKI-related analysis in these environments. There are mail settings that we will be analyzing and assessing. There are network settings, some of which I've referred to, like port scanning and all the different connections. So we cover multiple of these environments, and we're extending it and making sure that we're introducing both innovative and active and relevant and risky kind of dimensions to the assessment. Already covered 12, but we're extending it and moving forward with this.
Okay, one more question that we have via private message here. Where do you see attack surface management developing in the market in 2023?
Okay, good question. The space today of attack surface management eventually is on many different levels falling under the category of CASM, which is more of the internal attack surface management, and ESAM, external attack surface management place. And the way both analysts see it and some players see it, there is a kind of a move to think customer side, meaning don't think of it like external or internal attack surface management, but more as attack surface management. If you see like my presentation, I did not refer to external because the customer thinks of the attack surface management. What are the concerns? And we definitely see where things are going in that direction. I think this is kind of an important step moving forward in this space.
Okay, so that's it for the questions that have come in. Thanks very much, Michael, for that presentation. Before we wrap up here, a couple of things I wanted to mention. First of all, just as a reminder, we did record today's presentation. So keep an eye in your email for a link to the recording on the next day or so. Also, I wanted to mention that coming up, the next webinar in our Cyberpion Attack Surface Management webinar series will be coming up on Wednesday, January 11th. And in that presentation, we'll be talking about the cybersecurity New Year's resolution, how companies or enterprises are going to need to go on the offense as they start building their 2023 playbook for cybersecurity. So keep an eye out in your email for invitations to that, and on our website coming up in the next few days, you'll see that listed. Thank you very much, Michael, for that presentation, and thank you very much in the audience for joining our webinar today in the Cyberpion Attack Surface Management webinar series.